Hi, welcome to another De Gruyter book talk. I'm Pablo Dominguez and I lead the communications department at De Gruyter. And I am very excited to welcome today Elisa Cuter, Guido Kirsten and Hanna Prenzel. Hello, everyone. Great to have you.
Thanks for having us.
So I am not going to do a huge round of introductions, but I will say that you all form part of a research group at the Film University Babelsberg, which is on cinematic discourses of deprivation. And we will hear more about what that means exactly in a second. Now, as a part of that work and of that research group, the three of you have edited a collection called Precarity in European Film, which is the topic of our book talk today, and which De Gruyter has just published as a hardcover book and also in open access. So the book is freely available online. There's the print version. The link will be posted in under the video, so you can read the book for free online. Which I would suggest everyone does. Now, before we dive in and talk about the book and what it's about, I would like to talk about the book series that this book is a part of. So this is the first volume in a new book series that you are also editing called Film, Class, Society. Now, obviously, from what we've heard and what I've said about the research group, these issues of class and of labor are very central to your research. And I would like to know why you think these are relevant topics and why you decided to publish a new book collection on class, film, and society.
So I will start to answer this question. We launched this book series together with our dear colleague, Daniel Fairfax, first of all. And it's based on the assumption, as you said before, that the existence of classes has always shaped our society and, of course, our ways of living together. And today we experience especially these effects of social classes, like growing economic and financial inequalities. So against this backdrop, we think that this book series is an intervention into film and media studies, because in contrast to issues of gender and race, class relations remain surprisingly unaddressed in film and media studies. And just to be clear, we are not interested in a class reductionism. So of course we consider from a class perspective also the intersectionality of different categories of social injustice. So when we talk about matters of class, so the topics are division of labor, exploitation, housing, poverty. I'm interested in how those matters of class, those topics are translated into fictional and documentary film. So the book series has question stereotypes of poor, precarious, marginalized people, and also ask how film can evoke viewers' emotions, and also how films are able to question social injustice and take maybe collective action against it. So that's in a nutshell, I would say, what the book series is about.
And I would add that our work is actually in communication with what we could call a kind of renaissance of the interest in the topic of class. There have been several, well, not enough probably, but several, at least some recent publications on the topic. And by the way, Guido actually wrote an interesting review of free book published in 2021. Those are both in the German-speaking context and English-speaking context. And those are, for example, a volume curated by Drelly Robnik called Klassen Sie in Soziale Konflikte und ihre Szenarien, or Stefan Gregory, Class Trouble, eine Mediengeschichte der Klassengesellschaft, and Sarah Atfield, Class on Screen. So I would say that the series is in a dialogue with this kind of resurgence of the interest on class. And one question that's actually interesting is why now and why not before? Like what happened that caused this kind of renewed interest in the focus of class, especially in film theory, that, as we said, is never, or like not so involved in investigating this specific topic. And this is what maybe can go a bit deeper in.
Yes,
yeah,
thank you.
I can add.
Sorry, Guido, do you want to add something?
Yeah, maybe just shortly. I would say that there have been attempts historically to kind of integrate questions of class and concepts of class, but they've never been as strong as the other strands in cultural theory that Hanna has mentioned before, like in terms of gender and race, for example, where we have a huge conceptual work and discussions about these topics and concepts that actually help us to understand these things. And I think this is a bit poor in cinema studies. And it was even like in the time when there was the high time of Marxist film criticism in the 70s, they focused mostly on questions of ideology, and that was often quite far away from like more specific questions of class relations and so on, and exploitation and housing. So they were more about the question of impression of reality created by the camera and so on, and the kind of more general bourgeois vision of the world. Whereas in recent years, I think because of neoliberal politics probably, and precarity and precarization of society, and new classes, maybe there has been this interest. I think also maybe channeled through auto-fictional and autobiographical works, which have been much discussed in Europe, but elsewhere, actually everywhere. There is this renewed interest in these questions. And I think we're going to see a lot of interesting publications in the upcoming years. And as Hanna also said, we believe it's an intervention into the field of film and media studies, with which we want to show that it's actually important to do this work today and to try to develop concepts and a new and deeper understanding of class relations in our society through visual media, through like how there are configurations of questions of social shame, for example, in the cinema, and how we can relate to these things by watching films and TV series and so on, and to get a deeper understanding of what it feels like to be part of a certain class in a certain situation and so on. So this is actually, I guess, our goal with the creation of this book series.
Thank you. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. And at the same time, I kind of would like to dig a little deeper because I'm interested in this point. I also saw it in the introduction where you Guido, I think, emphasized this point of, there was things like Marxist film criticism in the 70s, but that's not really the kind of analysis of class that we are looking for in what we're doing today. And I kind of, I don't know, stumbled over the sentence where you said that, class has never enjoyed such a high priority, because I thought, even if we go further back, maybe into the 1920s, 1930s, like very sort of classical texts of, film sociology and cultural criticism, even something like Krakow or something, isn't class like a really central category of analysis there? And is that something you would hark back to, or where you would say it's something we should rediscover? Or do you say, what we're doing is something completely different?
Yeah, that's also a good question. And of course, you're right. And Krakow is certainly canonical. So Krakow is not someone who really needs to be rediscovered within film studies, or we could say that he has actually already been rediscovered in the past decades or so. And when you look at those texts, there are not actually as many which are specifically about class. So there's maybe Die Ladenmädchen gehen ins Kino, or Die kleinen Ladenmädchen gehen ins Kino, which is one of these canonical texts. And there is one about film criticism, where he's also linking film criticism to criticism of ideology. But when it comes to the central works, or the most well-known like monographs that he has written, there Yeah, and class is not essential anymore. So if you take the theory of film, for example, you don't find as much. And even in those years, I think, and you're right about like the late 20s and early 30s, the question of class was very popular in filmmaking. It was very important in a wave of films, especially from Berlin, which were called the so-called Sille films, up to the Brecht film, Kohle Wampe. But I don't think it has been mirrored as much in film theory and film criticism. And once film theory moved into the academic field, there was always a bit downplayed or maybe overshadowed by other concepts which have been much more discussed. So I guess there is still a lot of work to do, but I agree, there's also work of rediscovery to do when it comes to these older films and debates around that time, because of course there were debates, but not as canonical.
Maybe we could mention that we actually considered after discussing with the editorial board, the advisory board of our series, it's actually been a suggestion to maybe try to collect or to put together a reader of previous attempts to tackle the question of class. And it's something we're starting to think about. We don't know if it's actually going to happen, especially because there's certain lack of very theoretical approaches to the film in film studies, but it's something we're actually thinking about. So
that is one idea that came out of a recent meeting with our advisory board, which is really nice because they really support us and have new ideas and so on. There was something that came up, and maybe we could combine like more canonical texts with new approaches and create an interesting monograph or volume for this book series.
Yeah. I actually think that's a great idea, because that's maybe it's kind of like a pet peeve of mine or something. But I even if I think about class, there's this new interest in class now since the last 5 years or a bit more, with Didier Eribon and everything that came out of that, and so. But then I feel there's so much context lacking because we're not really looking at the research that has already been done. So it's kind of and I think maybe it's the same in film studies. But I don't want to dwell on this point for too long, otherwise we'll get lost here. So let's talk a bit more about the book Precarity in European Film, sure. And the subtitle is Depictions and Discourses. So can one of you tell me or tell us briefly what the book is about and what it isn't about, and why people should read it?
So, the book, Here You See It Again, is based on an international symposium, which was held at Film University in January 2020. So right before, this is the poster Guido was pointing at. So just before COVID-19 became a major issue, and it was took place in the context of the research project you mentioned in the beginning, where all the three of us are part of it. So different scholars from European countries were invited to present the cinematic depiction of precarity in different European regions, like in their filmic traditions. And the idea was to draw an imaginary map of the representations and to compare traditions, stylistic and narrative approaches, recurring themes and political implications. And this is quite a huge challenge to do. And that's what we discussed during the conference. And for the volume, we asked those participants and also other authors to give on the one hand, a general overview of what the representation of precarity means in their filmic tradition and also contemporary works, of course. And also we asked them to also discuss a prominent example. And this is also something where the authors responded in different ways too, because it's such quite a difficult thing to do. So we have got, in the end, we've got 19 contributions from 21 authors. And they're quite creative solutions to this task we gave them. So some highlighted filmic traditions, other were more interested in contemporary works. So we also have sociological, philosophical approaches. But of course, the subject or the topics we have been mentioning beforehand for the book series, like housing crisis, evictions, for example, in Spanish cinema of Precarity, or the question how the precarization of the working class is inherited in the youth. This is, for example, in the chapter of post-Yugoslav cinema, a topic. So yeah, we have like a wide range, let's say. And I think we consider this book as a starting point to discuss the question of precarity in European film. So it's like, yeah, it's like having this big, the big range of what this means.
Right. Great. So maybe we can talk a little about some of the essays in a bit. But first, I think it would be important to talk a bit about the term precarity, which is in the book's title, which I think is something everyone sort of had, or most people probably have an idea of what that means. What is your what does precarity mean for you, and why did you choose that term or that concept? Why do you think is it important at the moment?
Yeah, it became more and more important for us as a research group when we started to work together. We've been discussing a lot of texts, like from different origins, like philosophical works, or more sociological works. And we discovered that this was really a very central term in new studies of poverty and in social studies in general, I would say. And it has become a new paradigm of tackling questions of class and poverty in the past 20 years or so. And I think this has to do with some kind of discontent with older paradigms of studying poverty, for example, social exclusion, which was maybe the term most used in the 1980s and early 1990s. But it has the disadvantage of not acknowledging that precarity or the phenomenon of precarity has become so widespread that it doesn't only touch the older parts of society or the older milieus and classes of society, but has become much more widespread phenomenon. And I think there are two things which are important to mention. One is that precarity is kind of an umbrella term which covers, on the one hand, those which are even worse off, you could say, than the classical poor, meaning that they really have to struggle, the so-called working poor, with very short-term contracts and a complete lack of social security, who are really working from day to day. And this has become a more widespread phenomenon in Western societies as well, but is also present all over the world. And on the other hand, there are groups which are maybe a bit better off and not actually poor, but are also a kind of vulnerable in the sense of that they have short-term contracts, that they have an unclear future and not so clear career prospects and so on. And all this has created the situation where scholars like Pierre Bourdieu used to say precarity is everywhere now. And this has really touched the basis of society. Or others say that precarity is the new normal. That is the formula by Lauren Bolland, who is very important in this context because she introduced the term of the cinema of precarity in her book Cruel Optimism in 2011. And so we've been discussing many films with this focus of the term of precarity. What I think is really important as well, besides of this new paradigm of poverty, is that precarity is a term that also covers affects and emotions much more than poverty, or the term poverty used to do, because it's really very much about this feeling of insecurity, of vulnerability, of dependence on others. And we were looking at filmic or audiovisual configurations that are able to represent these kinds of feelings that come along with the phenomenon of social precarity. And then once you have this concept and you look at those films, it's, I think, getting more interesting, and you have a richer approach, because you can tackle these different kinds of emotions like anxiety, depression, anger, and so on, that come along with that, and developments or character constellations and so on. And you can actually learn through the films what it feels like to be in that situation, either because it's a situation that is quite different from your own as a viewer, or because it's actually similar, but you have never seen it represented in that way. So that is actually, you're actually able to reflect upon these situations in relation to your own situation. And I think this is the way we can, in fact, learn from the cinema about what it is like to be, or what it feels like to be precarious in contemporary society.
I think that it's important also to add that the history of the concept is very important also in the meaning of the concept. So our choice to use precarity, which is actually a term that it's been discussed, and it's not like universally accepted, I would say, because, for example, the book by Guy Standing, The Precariat, The New Dangerous Class, was, for example, very widely debated, but also critically debated, because his use of the precariat as a class is seen as a way to kind of break with the Marxist tradition of class reading. So there is a lot of debate around the term, but I think that using precarity in our field also means to kind of take a political stance, since, as we said, the term precarity started like to be developed by the French sociological discourse, also the speech by Bourdieu that Guido quoted was held at a conference in 1997 called Rencontre européenne contre la précarité. So it was already something that was debated in that context, but it was taken by, and it was widely used and became part of the broader also journalistic, for example, discourse, especially by the demonstration and the protests in the early 2000s in Southern Europe. I'm thinking of the May Day parades or other kind of upheavals in Spain or Greece and so on. So the fact that it was broadened by this kind of activist tradition links it and connects it much more to a kind of discourse that's fundamentally concerned with politics. It sees like poverty and precarization as an actual and direct consequence of neoliberal politics. So it is more linked to this kind of specific context that was called like the neoliberal turn of Western countries. And at the same time, as Guido said, it is both wider than poverty as a concept, because it includes a vast array of different subjects, as Guido already said, and a vast array of different affects and effects in terms of both subjective and objective consequences of the ongoing precarization. And on the other hand, it's more precise because it tackles specifically what is happening right now in Western countries. So I think, it has like this kind of advantages in terms of an analysis.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, and I totally get that. You already kind of answered my next question, because I wanted to ask about the role of cinema, but because you also talked about this role of affect and emotion for this concept of precarity, and it makes a lot of sense to me that that's something where cinema then or film becomes very important, because you can see certain things that you can't in maybe sociological data or other ways of researching these questions, right? Let's talk a bit maybe about the different sort of essays that are in the book, because so I have to be honest, I couldn't read them all, of course. And so one thing I wanted to ask is, are there sort of, I mean, you have these different case studies from different European countries, as you mentioned, and are there any sort of common themes that emerged in these different countries that you found around the representation of precarity? Or on the other hand, did you find any significant differences in how precarity is represented in these different cinemas? Who wants to go?
Maybe I can just come back to the point that you were making before about the special role of cinema. Just a very short point, which I think is pretty important, is that I have the feeling or the idea that a cinema often gives you a kind of personification or a kind of substantialization of phenomena that otherwise remain rather abstract. So, for example, when you read about a certain topic, such as poverty or precarity or unemployment and so on, you don't have a concrete idea of what it's about. But the films give you this possibility to actually think about concrete lives and fates and feelings and so on. And I think this is a very important thing, that you maybe have like certain images in your mind of certain characters of those films. Like, for example, the main characters of the Ken Loach films come to mind when you think about the gig economy. If you think about a film as Sorry We Missed You, you have like this very concrete image of this disintegration of a family before your eyes when you read about like effects or effects actually of this new deregulated gig economy. And I think this is a very important point in a kind of epistemology of cinema, which is that it's a different kind of knowledge that we get through that. And I think this is something that is really important and maybe often still underestimated, because maybe people talk about, well, those are fictional stories and so on, but actually these are the images that we have in our minds when it comes to these things. I don't know who wants to answer about the different essays and topics. I don't know. Do you want to start, Hanna? I can also add something later.
Yeah, actually, I wanted to add something to the question beforehand. Like when you, sorry, we had 3 people, so different brains and ideas. When you ask, like, what is the book about and what it's not about, I think it's important to say that the focus was not to look at precarious production studies, because this is something that people often think about, and that's of course a very important part when we think about film productions, and maybe also films that are more in the sphere of activist context, as Elisa mentioned beforehand. Of course, then you have to talk about precarious production processes, but this was not something we were tackling in this first volume. This will be something that will take place further in the book series. And for us, talking about precarity in European film, we have like this little subtitle, right, that says Depiction and Discourses. So for us, on the one hand, the question of, so who is represented in precarious in contemporary European film, and are we witnessing new iconographies, for example, was like a question that was important for us, and that's like a red thread throughout the volume. And of course, not all of the chapters and authors are answering it like very precisely, but it's like one question we had. And the other one is, and that's also like a general approach we are also having in our research project, is the question of discursive film analysis, and the question of how like larger contexts and structures can be integrated, and has to be integrated actually when we look at phenomenon like exploitation, housing, like those huge sociological phenomenon. How can it be included in those film analyses? And like, for example, how do the films also react to broader public discourses? This is something that's like very important for the approach we have. So I would say in all the contributions, there was always the attempt to contextualize either the films or the TV series, or also artworks like free channel installation, for example. We also so it's always important to contextualize in this specific European country the housing crisis in Spain is, of course, a different one than in Istanbul and Turkey or in Berlin. So this was, for example, a current theme already in the conference, but also in the book. And another one is, for example, the question of how the Roma and Sinti people are marginalized and how this is represented in films. So this was also like a recurrent theme. Maybe someone else wants to add.
Yeah, I would say that, of course, like we were able to locate similar social issues in different countries, because, as Baudieu said, precarity is everywhere in a way. But it meant it something differently, but I think it applies in this case too. But actually, we also had to face the fact that precarity is not the same in every country. Of course, like post-communist countries have a completely different approach to the problem, or precarity is not as widespread in all countries. Of course, there is a big difference between northern and southern European countries, and I think this reflects as well in the different chapters and in the film that are produced by the different areas. But yeah, unfortunately, like we couldn't compare them more thoroughly, because every author had its own perspective, which was located in the same area. So I think one thing that still needs to be done is like keeping on reflecting on how like this kind of differences can be can make a deeper census in terms of how like these different geographical experiences influence the way the depictions and the discussions, I would say, of the different countries.
Yeah. And sorry, I wanted to ask, because now I'm thinking about all the different films, that were discussed during the conference and that are in the book, and I'm interested to hear, film tips, like is there like one that really stood out for you, where you say, everyone has to watch this movie if they want to, understand what precarity means today? Try to choose one.
Just one. Oh, that's really tough, because there are really several we would probably recommend.
You're three persons, so
also everyone can choose one of them. Well, I guess I would choose a film that's maybe not as prominent in the book, but it's very prominent in the whole debate about precarity, which is quite central in one of the chapters by Laurent Belland in the book I've mentioned before, Cruel Optimism. And that is the film Ressources Humaines by Laurent Conté. It's from 1999, but it's really one of the paradigms and the canonical examples, because there is a connection, I think, between a class analysis, because the main character is the son of a worker who then studied economy and comes back to the same factory where his father's working. And then this is a time of the dismantling of the French welfare state and deregulation of labor laws and so on. And in this situation, there's also a confrontation inside the family. So the younger son is actually kind of attacking his father for making him feel ashamed of his own working class background. And the father is really more of a very passive subject, trying to work and to do everything right, so that his son has actually the possibility of becoming important in the economical world. And this is something that the son is actually feeling ashamed of, that his father is trying to avoid him to become a worker. So it's a very interesting constellation. But that's only one film, and I would like to mention so many others. But yeah, at least one.
Elisa, what are your favorites?
It's really hard to pick one, but I would say it's actually, I think it's interesting that I would be curious to hear what Hanna said. I have kind of the feeling that if we have to choose a film on precarity, especially, we would all focus on kind of the precarization of the middle class. Because I would, for example, put Eine flexible Frau by Tatiana Turansky. And it's again a case of someone that was somehow hoping for some social security, was used to the social security that came from a previous phase of capitalism, which was Fordism, in which there was like this kind of pact between capital and labor that kind of gave some kind of certainties to the working class, and instead it's kind of becoming or falling really. I think that the film by Turansky is also interesting because there's this also visualization of this downfall, falling out of what felt like a middle class condition, in which there was also the hope for a kind of also personal fulfillment and expression. The protagonist is a precarizing and recently unemployed woman architect, and so this, I think, what best visualizes precarity more than are not situations of extreme poverty, but this kind of tendency that encompasses whole society of losing any kind of rights that had been fought for and gained in the previous phase.
Thank you. That's great. We're going to link all of those, maybe trailers or put links to the films. Hanna, what's you have to say? You have to mention a film too.
I'm laughing because actually, like, if you want to talk about Eine flexible Frau, it's actually the contribution in the volume. So Elisa was kind of stealing the film.
Exactly, stole yours. I knew that. I'm sorry, but I don't have any great example in my chapter on Italy. I would say, like, I have some good films, but no films that really like catches maybe the concept as you do. Sorry, I went first.
No worries. So I think this film is especially interesting because it's on the one hand talking about how a person is able or actually not able to find strategies of refusal to these precarious conditions. So this person is like in this spiral of precarization, and we see her really like falling down. And I think the film, and this is something that we are actually discussing also a lot in the research project and in the volume, the question of how this is related to film history. And of course, if we say precarity is a nowadays analysis since the 80s, we have to say no, it actually goes further on, and it has been also the reality for many people, for many precarized, marginalized people, but maybe the term precarity hasn't been that prominent yet. So actually, I find it's interesting also as a film tip, even though it's from 78, it's like a very prominent feminist film called Die allseitig reduzierte Persönlichkeit, Redupas by Helke Sander. And there it's actually a film that could be seen as a prior example of Eine flexible Frau, because there you also have like a single mother, photographer, so a freelancer working also in a collective. So you have like one single person, and you have all these precarious conditions in her character. And her way of dealing is also a very sarcastic and ironic version of it. And it's like a film where you have the impression you watch it today and it's 45 years ago. And even though there's so many subjects and so many links, especially to a feminist perspective of precarization, that is like very astonishing. And I think this question of how historical examples are actually telling as much as contemporary ones, it's also a question we are like evolving around.
Yeah, fantastic.
This also has to do with the different kinds of traditions, I think, in different filmmaking countries. And for example, this very strong feminist strand in the 1970s in Germany, where you had a lot of films that are becoming more interesting now, where there's also a new interest in feminist filmmaking. And they have already reflected very much upon their own precarious conditions of living and working, or and that's also, I think, one thing that is interesting, that you have a lot of this kind of self-reflective moves, and also moves between documentary and fiction filmmaking. So where you have many interesting films which border on these categories, where you have parts which you could say are really, really documentary, and others which are much more fictionalized. This is, I guess, something that is in general quite interesting about this new cinema of precarity that we're talking about, and something that you can find in many films from different regions, actually. And again, when it comes to topics, I think there are many topics that have come up in different countries in different ways, as we said before. Like, for example, the question of housing has become really important and really a central topic in many different parts of Europe, but also, of course, unemployment, insecure job conditions, the exclusion of certain maybe racialized groups, and so on. So you have these different topics that pop up here and there, but in different ways and under different conditions, and under the different conditions of different cinematic traditions and different industries and possibilities of filmmaking, of course. But I think, that's what's really interesting about the book, is that we have so many experts from different regions and countries in Europe, so that it's actually able to compare these different countries and filmmaking traditions. And
thanks, Guido.
And I would like to add so many other films that I would like to talk about, because there were actually many great films. And we should at least mention the Dardenne brothers, because if you follow their career, you could even say that there is there's a trajectory of different kinds of being precarious. And many of their films have been crucial to our discussions, and we should at least mention them. Maybe give some links to these films as well.
Yeah, I know it's hard to mention to mention one. I completely get that. But the rest of the films are in the book, so everyone. Yeah, of course.
Yeah, we decided to include a film list for every chapter, so not only a bibliography, but also a film list. So it's actually, I think, also useful for those people who are interested in maybe programming or watching more of these films and reading up about them. They can also use the book in this way and actually find many interesting films.
Yes. So we have a lot to read. We have a lot of films to watch, a lot of work, and hopefully fun as well ahead of us. Unfortunately, we have to kind of come to a close. I would love to continue talking about this forever, but we should not get carried away, so it doesn't become too long. So last question, tell us, what is coming up in the book series, Film Class and Society. Are there any plans already for further publications, and what can people sort of wait for?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think the most planned or concrete project is one by a film scholar called Tim Lindemann, who's working on a book called, I think, New Rural Cinema. And it's about landscape, poverty, community, and recent US independent films. And he's focusing on, as the title says, the rural poverty, which has dramatically risen in the past decade or so. And so he's looking at the effects of neoliberal policies in the United States on these rural communities. He has a focus on a new kind of depiction of landscape and on community, and also on the resistance against precarization and poverty in these communities. And there are interesting films that he's discussing in the book. Ballas, Winter's Bone, for example, Beasts of the Southern Wild, Nomadland, and so on. So films which have also really been interesting cinematography, filmically, but also thematically. And I think this is a very interesting contribution to this discussion in the United States, because our book was focused on Europe, and this is then on US independent filmmaking. This is the first volume which is going to follow up on our book, and I think it's going to come out early next year. So we hope,
Fantastic.
Then both our dissertations, mine and Hannah's, are gonna hopefully be published in the series. And I'll just say a couple words about mine. And my research is focusing on the depiction of precarious workers in the fields of cognitive and artistic labor. So it's basically intellectuals or artists that are like leading a precarious life. And actually there have been several films tackling the topic, which does not surprise, because also like the film industry is an industry that's based on artistic and intellectual labor. So, and it's a precarizing field as well. So I basically found out that many of these depictions are self-biographical, like they're autofictions in a way, and most of them are also comedies. So I'm trying to triangulating those aspects of precarity, comedy, and self-autobiography or self-representation. And I think it's an interesting topic, at least for me. I think hopefully it's gonna be an interesting book for the public as well.
I'm sure.
Me too.
Thank you. Yeah. Hanna, do you wanna add something about your book?
Sure. Like the book I'm working on, it's on the question of how feminist labor struggles and forms of collective labor in film are interangled. So I'm looking at films where we see the depiction of, I say, so-called feminist labor struggles. So labor struggles in the reproductive sphere, like in, for example, from cleaners, or wildcat strikes for better working conditions for women, or also decentralized individual strike strategies in precarious times. So those are all topics I'm analyzing in different film examples, and always asking the question, because these films have been all made in some sort of collective way. So it's always the question of how these production processes are also reflected into this discourse of the film or the depiction of those struggles. So yeah, that's my book I'm working on.
Thank you. Yeah, so I mean, we obviously really look forward to those books then coming out and being published. Thank you again for giving us a peek. And again, there's a lot to look forward to in this series, I guess. So
there's more coming up afterwards. There are more projects which are not as concrete yet, but yeah, we're all working on different things.
Yes. Thanks, Guido. So with that, unfortunately, we're running out of time. So I would like to thank you very much, Elisa, Guido, and Hanna, for this conversation. It's been a lot of fun, I think. Very interesting. Thanks for taking the time and for sharing your insights with us. And see you soon, hopefully. And for everyone watching, join us for the next episode of our book talks as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pablo, for having us. That was a pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.